In March 1942, the Java Sea was no longer a safe place for anything flying a Dutch flag. The Japanese Navy ruled the air and water, striking daily across the scattered islands of the East Indies. Somewhere off the coast of Java, a small Dutch minesweeper, the Abraham Crijnssen, sat motionless in the heat. Her engines were cold. Her decks were invisible beneath a mound of palm branches, vines, and mud. From above, she looked like a sand-colored bump in the sea, fringed with green, one of the countless islets scattered across the archipelago. The men on board did not move. They listened for the hum of aircraft engines, the sound that meant death. For hours at a time they stayed still, breathing through cloths to muffle coughing, waiting for the next patrol to pass. When the planes did appear, the camouflage held. Shadows slid over the sea, then faded. The men exhaled and began to clear away leaves from the vents before the heat below decks became unbearable. 8 days earlier, Crijnssen had been part of a doomed naval defense. The Allied fleet in the Dutch East Indies had collapsed under relentless air attacks. Communications were gone, command scattered. Ships that tried to flee in daylight were sunk before they cleared the coast. The Crijnssen's crew, 20-odd sailors and officers, had been ordered to escape if possible. But a steel ship with a top speed of 12 knots could not outrun Japanese aircraft. Their only chance was to vanish. Now, surrounded by sea and silence, they were testing an idea so strange it barely seemed naval at all. To survive not by speed or firepower, but by deception. The minesweeper had become a patch of jungle floating on the ocean. The crew's lives depended on whether that illusion could hold from one night to the next. The story began weeks earlier, as the Japanese Empire swept south through the Pacific. In early 1942, the Netherlands East Indies became one of its final targets, a prize of oil, tin, and rubber. The Dutch colonial defenses were thin, their ships mostly pre-war craft built for patrol, not battle. When the United States and Britain withdrew after the fall of Singapore, the Dutch were left to face the full force of Japan's navy and air arm almost alone. In February, Allied commanders formed a temporary coalition, the American-British-Dutch-Australian Command, known as ABDA. Its fleet gathered at Surabaya and Cilacap, trying to block the Japanese advance toward Java. Among them was the Abraham Crijnssen, a small minesweeper launched in 1937 from Rotterdam's Gusto shipyard. Just 60 meters long, she carried a crew of 23 in light armament, a single 3-inch gun, and a few machine guns. Her hull was steel but shallow, built for coastal waters and mine clearance near harbors. In an open-sea war, she was nearly defenseless. By the end of February, the campaign had turned catastrophic. The Battle of the Java Sea, fought on February 27, 1942, ended with the destruction of most of the Allied fleet. 2 cruisers and 3 destroyers were lost. Survivors scattered in every direction. The Dutch admiral, Karel Doorman, went down with his flagship. Japanese aircraft now roamed the region at will. At Surabaya, Crijnssen's crew received their final orders: make for Australia if you can. The message was short, stripped of optimism. Escape meant crossing over 1,000 kilometers of enemy-controlled water. Any vessel seen in daylight was almost certain to be bombed. The ship's commander, Lieutenant Commander Frans Bertus van Meert, gathered his men in the wardroom: engineers, stokers, signalmen, most of them reservists. He told them the truth. There would be no escort, no radio contact, no help if they were found. The only plan was survival. They began preparing at once. Ammunition and spare mines were offloaded to lighten the ship. Fuel tanks were topped to capacity. Charts showed no safe route, only scattered islands and reefs between Java and the northern coast of Australia. At night, they could run the engines, but by day, they would need to hide. Van Meert studied the surrounding waters. The archipelago was a maze of coral, mangroves, and volcanic ridges. From altitude, land, and sea blurred together into irregular patches of green. Somewhere in that confusion lay the seed of an idea. If they could not fight and could not flee, perhaps they could disappear. The crew tested it with dry humor at first. One of the men joked about becoming an island. But the longer they looked at the charts, the more the idea began to seem possible. The ship's low profile might help. A coat of branches, dirt, and paint could break its outline. It was absurd, but every other plan ended with capture or death. By nightfall, the men began cutting brush along the shore and hauling it aboard. Their escape would depend not on steel or firepower, but on the oldest form of warfare, disguise. The work began before dawn. The Crijnssen was anchored in a quiet cove near Madura Island, shielded from open water by reefs. The men rowed to shore with machetes and axes, cutting branches from palms and mangroves. Each load was ferried back to the ship and hoisted aboard with ropes. Within hours, the deck was piled waist-high in green foliage. The ship smelled like fresh sap and damp soil. They worked in silence. The captain had made it clear that noise or smoke could draw attention from Japanese reconnaissance planes. The tropical heat pressed down. Men stripped to undershirts, their hands covered in resin. Branches were tied along the railings, hung from masts, draped over the gun mount. The single funnel was concealed beneath woven palm fronds, leaving only a narrow vent for exhaust. Buckets of mud were hauled from the shallows and spread over the deck to dull the reflection of metal. When they finished, the Crijnssen looked less like a naval vessel than a floating garden shed overtaken by jungle. The transformation had a strange effect on the crew. The ship that had once been their machine now felt alive, a fragile ecosystem they had to maintain. Each morning they checked for drying leaves and replaced them. The camouflage had to remain convincing even to a pilot's passing glance. When the first Japanese aircraft appeared overhead, everyone froze. The sound of the engines grew, passed directly above, then faded. No bombs followed. The illusion had held. That night, they raised anchor and began the first leg of their journey south. Their plan followed a strict rhythm: move under darkness, hide by daylight. The engine was kept at low power to reduce the exhaust plume. Each dawn, they sought cover near reefs or small islands, dropped anchor, and rebuilt the camouflage that the night's motion had stripped away. Meals were cold and silent. Cooking fires were forbidden. Conversation stayed brief, whispers between shifts at the helm. They steered using the stars and compass bearings, avoiding radio transmissions that might betray them. Navigation was slow and uncertain. The charts were incomplete. Reefs were not always where they were marked. At times, the water grew shallow enough to show coral beneath the hull. The men took turns standing watch at the bow, guiding the ship through by sight. Every night brought the same tension: the blackness of the sea, the vibration of the diesel engine, the fear of a sudden aircraft flare. They encountered floating debris, splintered timbers, and oil slicks from destroyed ships. Once, they passed a lifeboat adrift and empty. It was a reminder of what failure looked like. By the fourth day, fatigue set in. The men slept in turns, damp and cramped beneath the deck. Yet, discipline held. Each successful sunrise meant the disguise was working, the enemy still unaware. Somewhere to the south lay freedom, but no one dared speak the distance aloud. The only rule was to keep moving when darkness fell, and never, under any light, look like a ship again. By the fifth night, the Crijnssen had cleared the north coast of Java and entered the open reaches of the Timor Sea. The water here was deeper, the distances greater, and the isolation absolute. They had not seen another friendly ship since leaving the coast. Only the glow of distant fires on the horizon marked where other vessels had been destroyed. Fuel became the next concern. Running the engines even at reduced power drained reserves faster than expected. Van Meert ordered the speed kept to 6 knots. Every drop would have to last until Australia. The men rationed water as well. The tropical humidity was punishing, and condensation collected on the bulkheads was scraped off to drink. Salt crusted their uniforms. the smell of vegetation on deck mixed with diesel fumes and mildew. The camouflage, once fresh and green, began to decay. Leaves shriveled under the sun, turning brown. Mud cracked in the heat. Each morning, they replaced what they could, rowing to nearby islets to cut new branches. Time on shore was dangerous. Any aircraft could appear without warning. On the sixth day, they encountered evidence of how closely the Japanese controlled the region. A reconnaissance plane passed at altitude, its silver fuselage flashing briefly in the sun. The crew froze. The ship drifted, engines silent. The plane circled once, then continued east. They waited another hour before anyone spoke. By nightfall, they were crossing the latitude of Timor, still unseen. The men had begun to move with automatic precision. Engine off at first light, branches inspected, perimeter checked, radio silence maintained. The tropical nights were long, filled with mechanical rhythm and the sound of waves against steel. Occasionally, phosphorescence lit the wake in faint blue streaks, a trail visible for miles. They cut the engines and drifted until it faded. On the seventh night, they reached open waters south of Timor, the last stretch before the Australian coast. The weather turned rough, squalls rolled in from the south, waves slamming against the hull. Rain stripped leaves from the camouflage, but the storm also offered cover. Japanese patrols rarely flew in such conditions. The ship pushed on, the crew soaked and half-blind, navigating by flashes of lightning and compass bearings. By dawn, the storm had passed. The sea was calm again, empty to the horizon. They had made it through the patrol zone. That afternoon, the lookout sighted a faint line on the southern edge of the sky. Land. It was the coast of Western Australia. When Abraham Crijnssen entered Geraldton Harbor on March 15, 1942, the harbor authorities did not recognize her at first. A green mound moved slowly through the inlet, dripping seawater and leaves. Only when the engine stopped and men began to appear from under the foliage did anyone understand what they were seeing, a warship that had crossed an ocean disguised as an island. When the Abraham Crijnssen anchored in Geraldton, her arrival caused confusion more than celebration. Harbor personnel had never seen anything like her, a small, mud-colored vessel coated in rotting vegetation, dripping seawater, smelling of earth and decay. Local fishermen helped tie her to the pier. As the crew climbed down, they looked more like castaways than sailors, unshaven, uniform shirts bleached by salt, eyes hollow from lack of sleep. Officials boarded cautiously, unsure who they were or where they had come from. When Van Meert presented his papers, the truth spread quickly. The Dutch minesweeper had made it through nearly 1,000 kilometers of enemy-held ocean under her own power, evading aircraft, submarines, and patrol boats. For a brief moment, she became a sensation, a symbol of resistance amid defeat. Photographs were taken. Mechanics examined her hull, still covered with clumps of dried mud and palm branches. Every mark on her steel plates told a story of survival through invention rather than firepower. After inspection, the Royal Australian Navy took her into service. The camouflage was cleared away, the hull repainted in gray, and the Crijnssen was recommissioned as an anti-submarine escort based out of Fremantle. Her new crew included Dutch and Australian sailors working together under the RAN flag. In the months that followed, she performed convoy protection and training duties along the Australian coast, quiet work, far from the desperate conditions she had escaped. Yet the story of her disguise spread among Allied forces, told with a mix of disbelief and admiration. To the Dutch expatriate community in Australia, the ship's arrival carried a deeper meaning. The fall of the Netherlands East Indies had been swift and humiliating. Entire fleets had been sunk, and tens of thousands of civilians captured. The Crijnssens' escape stood as proof that not all Dutch resistance had been extinguished. She had brought with her more than a crew. She carried the idea that intelligence and persistence could still defy overwhelming power. For the men who had lived through it, the memory stayed physical. They spoke of the silence most of all. the enforced stillness under tropical sun, the weight of heat and fear when planes passed overhead. No one romanticized it. The disguise had not been cleverness for its own sake. It had been necessity, born from the understanding that survival required imagination as much as courage. When the war ended, the Abraham Crijnssen returned to the Netherlands. The journey home took her once again across vast distances, though this time in convoy and safety. In the post-war years, she served as a training ship for the Dutch Navy, instructing new sailors in seamanship and discipline. An ordinary role for a vessel that had once relied on extraordinary measures. In the 1960s, she was retired, preserved as a museum ship at the Dutch Navy Museum in Den Helder. Visitors walking her decks can still see the outlines of the gun mount and the low, narrow bridge, reminders of how small she was, how little protection she offered her crew. Photographs displayed nearby show the camouflage that once covered her, a crude but convincing jungle of leaves and branches, a floating deception that survived against a modern air force. The story endures not because it was grand, but because it was small and real. In a war measured by industrial destruction, the Crijnssens' escape demonstrated the opposite scale of warfare: the individual, the improvised, the human. No advanced technology saved her. What worked was observation, patience, and the ability to think differently under pressure. Historians have described it as one of the most improbable naval escapes of the Second World War. Yet it fits perfectly within its moment, the chaotic spring of 1942, when ordinary sailors found themselves improvising against the collapse of empires. The Crijnssen did not change the course of the war, but she revealed something about the people who fought it, that survival sometimes depended not on force, but on the simple act of refusing to be found. Her camouflage is gone now, her decks restored and polished, but the image remains: a small ship, disguised as an island, drifting through hostile waters, a fragment of steel and will, carrying its crew through the wreckage of a lost world toward the faint outline of another shore.